In this video today, I will take you through a bit of a journey to discover what it is about boomers that is so contemptible in the way that as a political class and in general how socially they've crippled what was probably the best gestalt of a society to have ever existed post World War II from a socio-economic standpoint, if not from a heroic or from a more deeply profound philosophical standpoint, then at very least from a very superficial and vapid level of things are going to get better for everyone, at least from a basic human welfare. So what we can then juxtapose that to is that there are still some good traits that boomers as a political class imbue, but in general, they personify what is a privileged class who have come to roost for far too long and not earned, nor had to struggle, nor had to suffer in any meaningful way for the power that they've been able to wield. Now, this is a probably sufferance from their parents' generation, the silent generation, who were willing to fight and die for a lot of ideals and then not necessarily require the attention that would have been requisite or commensurate to their sacrifices. And the boomers more or less supplanted them quite quickly in terms of as a political force, but then also as a social movement. And the removal of what we would call guardianship from a quite noble and hard-working class into what is quite quickly a proletariat class in the social way, if not in the economic way, one that did not have high regard or high standards for the finer things in life and just cared about the quantitative amount of things, in that they wanted more holidays, more money, more welfare, all of these things they built up in their heads as being better. There was never a question of whether the measurement was accurate, just that they had more of something. And in general, that worked for some, you could say, quality of life improvements, such as the race for technology and healthcare, but then also a negative factor for many others. And now we're having to pay the piper on a lot of these, and I can explain exactly why. I think I would like to bookend the video just with one quote from Spengler here and then another one from Thomas Carlyle after. But the first Spengler quote I think is quite pertinent and brings to the table quite a lot of the same ideas in the 1930s that we feel are relevant today to describe exactly how he was able to have this premonition of the current milieu. Spengler goes on to say in the Hour of Decision, which is one of his essays, "It is the arrogance of the urban intellect which, detached from its roots and no longer guided by strong instinct, looks down with contempt on the full-blooded thinking of the past and the wisdom of ancient peasant stock. It is the period in which everyone can read and write and therefore must have his say and always knows better. This type of mind is obsessed by concepts, the new gods of the age, and it exercises its wits on the world as it sees it. It is no good, it says. We could make it better. Here goes. Let us set up a program for a better world. Nothing could be easier for persons of intelligence, and no doubt seems to be felt that this world will then materialize of itself. It is given a label, human progress, and now that it has a name, it is. Those who doubt it are narrow reactionaries, heretics, and, what is worse, persons devoid of democratic virtue. Away with them." In this wise, the fear of reality was overcome by intellectual arrogance, the darkness that comes from ignorance of all things of life, spiritual poverty, lack of reverence, and finally, world-alien stupidity. For there is nothing stupider than the rootless urban intelligence. In English offices and clubs, it used to be called common sense. In French salons, esprit, and German philosopher studies, pure reason. The shallow optimism of the cultural Philistine is ceasing to fear the elemental historical facts and beginning to despise them. And I think this can be understood as hopefully very simply in the way that he's described it, and it resonates with you in that way. But for me, it's so evident now, and evidenced by people from the last election, so from the Trump election in particular. So there's, I think, from the 2016 American election, and potentially in conjunction with that, the Brexit vote, and this is, I'm just talking Anglosphere here, that you had a massive dissonance in between what people thought the people wanted, or what they were told that they should want, versus the actual intentions. If you give a referendum to a people, what will they choose? I think you have a distinct delineation between political people in a political world and the rest of us. So the mechanisms by which there's a feedback loop, typically, if it was a much more, at least decoupled, but a much more decentralized version of a political system, is that you get feedback from your local populace, and they would tell you and inform you how their feelings and thoughts work. And you would take that to the center of political life, which would be Westminster or DC or Berlin. But in that, we lost probably what is the most effective mechanism for democracy to actually function, and that we gave everyone the right to vote, and most of those people now live in cities, and those cities are concentrated in political centers. And so the politicians representing most of those people end up living in those centers and don't represent necessarily the broader populace, particularly those who live more rurally or regionally, and even in small towns and villages, because you have this arrogance, and it is more even a hubris, I think, where I know better, so let me tell you how it should work. And there's this level of credentialism, so as to say, I went to this school and I studied this thing, and you're an ignorant peasant, so what would you know? And this elitism just carries through, even to the commentariat. So you can see here pictures of, I think, most of us who have been on YouTube watching videos for the last decade or so are familiar with these faces. And we have what is distinctly some very unappealing, unattractive Englishmen, as well as some frumpy Germans. But in general, I think they're representative to a T, and that is quintessentially the class that they represent. So you have Tony Blair here, who I think was probably the most effective in terms of channeling boomerism into a political force, even more so than Bush. Bush was a very down-to-earth, salt-of-the-earth, almost Americana in its golden era, and never had any malicious intentions. Now, his inability to be a strong leader was probably a function of his, I would say, low IQ, but his maybe more average level IQ, and the reason he cared to be president had a lot to do with his family, rather than necessarily, I think, he's a bit of a good old boy, so would have been fine just hanging out on a ranch all day drinking Budweiser. In general, though, but Tony Blair is the epitome of the British political class, and he ran on a platform called New Labour, and New Labour basically appealed to what was the sentiment of the boomer, in that it was good-natured, but it was tough in ways that were good for you. But obviously, it was a very superficial toughness, and the toughness applied not to anyone he personally had any connection with on a level that it would ever come back to haunt him. So his ability to project a certain, we're doing what's best for you, the working class, was in probably quite stark contrast to the lives of the people that he was promising this change and enactment to. And if you think in the 90s in the UK, you had quite a severe drought in terms of economic opportunities, but also a large glut of criminal classes preying on young women, for instance. There's been a lot of grooming gangs who started in the 90s, mostly men of Pakistani origin, Bangladeshi origin, Muslims. And then you also had a lot of privation when it came to work and jobs outside of London. So obviously London is a bit of a utopia, or at least a little bit of an oasis in the desert of a poor economic situation for the UK. Blair, I think, tried to channel what was the discomfiture and, as I said, the privations of the rest of the UK in a way that would allow him to be effective as a politician or a political party leader and to be elected. But obviously his time in office was mostly centered around his own ego and what he felt he wanted to do. And I think that was primarily a boomerism, if you've ever seen one, in the face of it. And telegraphs to everyone on the planet what exactly boomers will do when they get power. It's they do what's best for them, and what's best for them is what they personally think and feel, not necessarily even what is actually best for them. They're very emotional, and boomers typically don't have to or don't like to be confronted with facts or the fact of the matters. I think the way that I would like to demonstrate that it's also an infection that's putrefied the commentariat class is how you see the carryover of boomer optimism. Now, optimism in general, I think, is unbecoming and unfitting to any person who is seriously relating themselves to the world in a way that they want to achieve meaningful change and progress and goals. So you can't accuse Alexander or Napoleon or Julius Caesar of being anything other than realists. They can have a dream and they can be goal-orientated and they can be fanciful in their notions, but the way that they deal with the practicalities of war and power and politics were done in such a way that they could harness their energy and channel it into actual productive progress towards their aims. Whereas our politicians, and this is something, if you're a millennial or even a Gen X, you'll have to have suffered through for the last 30, 40 years now, is boomers acting on whims. And the whims are more or less, they call it now an Overton window, but previously it was called the zeitgeist. And this zeitgeist was the determinant of what was moral and ethic at that time, which is what everyone felt was probably true. It was coloured quite starkly by the Soviet Union. So because you have this dichotomy and the effect of a polarization of political discourse, and you have such a strong enemy, you've presented with this, it has to be capitalist or it has to be communist. You can't take any other path. Obviously, all of us third way enjoyers understand the futility of arguing in a system that's a left and right spectrum when you have much more of a complex dynamic around economic, social, political policies. There's no way you can confine it to this axis, but let alone that discussion will stick to the topic, which was you're a capitalist, you're with us or you're against us, you're a Reagan, Thatcherite, or you're a Gorbachev, Trotskyist. And so from this, we got a split in the intelligentsia. We got these very he calls them common sense in the English term, people who were much more about rationality. And this is a product of the analytical school of philosophy. Analytical school was split from continental philosophy in the 1800s, or a bit earlier probably with Hume. But when we consider the development of analytical philosophy throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, it started to center and calcify much more around these fixed ideas of knowing and known, and morality and ethics being harnessable and understood and complete, a bit like mathematics. We treat it as a known and recovered science of, yes, if we can, like Karl Popper is a good example of being one of these woeful analytical philosophers who was probably by far the biggest betrayer of actual reason that I've had to suffer through. But in general, this is how they utilize their thinking ability, which was to say, here's a prescription of what can be said to be done in an ethical way. And this is where we get anything from what you might think is HR, or you call it political speak, not being able to express yourself in a way that's desirable, but in a way that's PC. And being PC was something invented by boomers because they didn't want to be contested, and they don't like this idea of a frontage. They don't like being offended. And I think they have a real large problem actually going into a kerfuffle or I'll say a brouhaha in like a fight. Basically, being able to be confronted by someone is I think to them, because they're quite a timid generation, quite shocking and painful for them, and psychologically painful. To be wrong to that degree is something that they're not capable of suffering through. And so you had such an easy dimension of thought here, where you just pick neoliberal, and that could be a conservative liberal or a progressive liberal, and we'll debate on this very thin wedge of issues that doesn't actually affect that many people. But that was the game was designed around this bounded space that was so thin and so not impactful that it didn't matter. No one really was having any proper discussion or merit around what was considered good. This is what we already consider to be the good profile. You can mix and match how you want, and we can call you conservative and we'll call you progressive, and then we'll be done with politics because we have what is functionally a uni party here. And that goes for the Democrat and Republicans just as much as it goes for the Tories and Labour, just as much as it goes for, you could say, some more continental European politics, which was inbuilt into their philosophies around, yes, you can be a farmer and vote the Farmer Party, but that's always going to vote for the Conservative Party, which is always going to be coalitioned towards the Christian or the party. And then opposites, obviously you have the Greens and the Labour and how they align themselves with communist parties, more or less, in such a distinct and easy to understand way. Now, we've been able to transcend those things to a degree. I think you have AfD in Germany, which is able to be a third option. You have Sverigedemokraterna in Sweden, which are the third option. And you have what is Trumpism now as a distinctly different option than Rhino Republican neoconservatives. Like, God help us, John McCain and the Bush era politicians. And then with English politics, I think it's much more refreshing to be able to deal with what is a reform or a liberal Democrat as a contest against what would be the incumbent Labour and Tory parties, which are so, as I said before, aged and inadequate in their understanding of current milieu and current zeitgeist, that they're not able to actually offer anything to a distinct part of the population. Thus, they don't become representable. They just become the, as I said before, incumbents, and they are able to attract votes because they're already known rather than being the best for what the people want. And I think this is maybe a very long discussion on why boomers in general have come to this degree of arrogance around their own ability or inability to govern, and it's just a dog and pony show to them. It's their ability to express egotistically themselves, and not egoism in the Max Stirner, I would say, transcendent way. But this is egoism in the, you have a large ego and you want everyone to know how smart you are, or how funny you are, or how good at things you are, rather than just letting the world appreciate it through action. It has to be told and said, and you have to be schooled in this. It's more than demagoguery. It's doctrine and indoctrination. And I'm a big fan of schooling. I mean, I'm not saying that you can't have a doctrine and you can't school people, but I think indoctrinating people in that Western ethics based on analytical philosophy is the only version of ethics and the only version of understanding, is a massive criminalization of thought and the freedom of thought. I myself had to go through very abstruse, you would say, methods to be able to educate and inculcate myself in, I would consider, a more well-rounded philosophical position. And it isn't that I'm saying my positions are the best. It's mostly around, if you don't know what thoughts you can have or you're allowed to have, or what that you may not necessarily be uncomfortable with being in a position which isn't considered PC, I think you can then free yourself from the spooks. And as you can see, boomers are the most spookified probably generation that's existed, even more so than Victorian or prior generations, which had much more effort towards politesse and manners, and that their badinage consisted of much less vulgarisms, but also had so many rules and strictures that you would become, it's quite cumbersome to obviously navigate social situations, where it's much easier for us today to navigate a social situation because the barrier for entry is lowered to what is zero functionally. And boomers, once again, have done that. They've said there is not allowed to be social elitism. You've gotten rid of an upper class and a middle class and a lower class, and you have two classes. You have a labor class and a managerial class, and they're separated only by money. None of it is by taste, none of it is by skills, none of it is by any disposition or clothing or any sort of signaling effect, other than if you have money, you'll be able to buy things that people with no money can buy cheap imitations of, because China obviously will ship fake Louis Vuitton, they'll ship fake Gucci, they'll ship cars that look like fancier cars. So poor people can live just almost simulacra of being a rich person, which to me is obviously function of consumerism as a goal, function as a consumerism, capitalism as an end game, rather than just methods or ways of living, which is what they were intended for. A capitalist was never intended for you to sit there and spend all your money on cheap Chinese plastic. It's just a function of demand, and there will always be people willing to supply things at prices. It's just we encouraged it. That's what we wanted for our society. We said we wanted the cheap Walmart, Sainsbury, crappy food, which is not healthy for us and full of chemicals, because we're willing to pay for it. We're not willing to spend 2 minutes reading a label which tells you what's in your food. I'm just going to buy the cheap Tesco meal deal. Then you get what you get, and you can't be upset. You have to also appreciate that boomers were born into a generational time period which was supremely easy. And I say this without irony. You have to appreciate, I think, in a general sense, that education for boomers was such a luxury that a dropout from high school was not that dissimilar in terms of their wage from a very well-educated master's and above person. So you had very many boomers starting their own business in terms of a 3 or 4 van HVAC company, or a lawn clipping company, or a plumbing company. Guys who could barely read and write were able to just have a few mates or chaps driving around in their vans, charging them out for not even outrageous rates, for decent rates, and doing decent work, and everyone there earning such a good living that they could afford a house. The wife doesn't necessarily have to work, and their 2 or 3 kids were growing up in a nice neighborhood in the suburbs. And credit where credit's due, I think, is probably maybe more for the silent generation, but boomers also, that they built something like a suburb. I think a suburb is actually an improvement to urban living. In Spengler's time period, obviously there was a clustering and a condensing effect of populations cramming themselves into urban centers, and the cosmopolitan lived in such a festering miasma of civilization that you had what would be New York effect of loud noise and lights and pollution, all these externalities, but endlessly ad infinitum. Every single day and night is some form of pollution entering your senses. And this is a deterioration for the mind. You have many psychic breaks, stress levels, cortisol levels, and there's a lot of ways that you unhealthy when you live in an environment like that. So I think the suburb is for sure an improvement. Getting people away from cities to a degree, having space and greenery is a massive improvement in the actual life and living experience of, particularly for children, but also for families. So I think in that regard, we can give some credit to, at least, if not the silent generation, to a large degree, probably also boomers. And then I think, once going back to the education, though, that because there was no discrepancy between education and the outcome of, well, not much of a discrepancy, and you can just see that here. So if I have a look at the silent generation, that you had what was barely a $7,000 gap between a high school educated and a bachelor's degree, whereas the millennial generation, which is still a very insufferable generation with it's avocado toast and complaining as a sport, but the bachelor degree having a substantial, and this is I think in American dollars, a substantial increase above almost, well, what is more than effectively 50% increase on salary on a high school graduate. So your ability to earn, I would say, a living wage as a millennial who's only got a high school diploma is absent. You've more or less handicapped or hamstrung yourself in a way that you'll never earn very much money unless you do have some element of entrepreneurial spirit and grit. And that is quite a daunting task for an 18, 19-year-old. I think it's very easy to sit in a gilded seat and say, why don't you take a risk? Why don't you do something? Why don't you this, that? But the reality is that just most people don't have that. They're not built that way. And that if you have the appetite for risk, then it's natural that you'll probably do things that will, at least from a monetary perspective, reward you much higher rates. But also you can have a lot of bankruptcies, and risk-taking doesn't necessarily funnel into good behavior. I think risk-taking obviously has a lot of people signing up to the army or to try to do other salacious or lugubrious activities, or having some people who are more attuned to crime rather than necessarily functioning society. So there is an element to that as well. And I think forcing what is now, I mean, any 18-year-old who looks at the difference in salary here is going to always pick a bachelor's degree if they can somehow manage it. They'll always want to have more money for what is equivalently lower stress, less coarse proletariat style work. Not many people at least want to sign up for back-breaking labor or working at McDonald's versus sitting in a nice office and sending emails. These are unequivalent in terms of the actual effect it has on a person in terms of their psychic sufferance and happiness, general overall satisfaction. The compounding effect to this, and this is where also boomers have gotten off, you could say, extremely well, is and you can see it here, average house is 8 times the average income. When boomers were around, they had, and they will tell you this, they had extremely high interest rates sometimes, and there was a lot of reasons for that. You had oil crises, you had financial crises all through the 70s and 80s and 90s, and you had a lot of these market dysfunctions, but at the same time, there was never such a huge discrepancy between a median salary and a house price. One single person by themselves could still afford to buy a property, and if that was a flat or a apartment or a condominium, and it's a attached home, or it's a suburban home, or it's a rural farm, there was still the ability to earn a normal wage and procure a mortgage, and then be able to buy it. And then the advent of what is the tech age or the internet age was a prodigious growth period, and you saw a strong level of financial gains for a lot of people. And this was not asymptotic, like you had a general linear increase between everyone's economic well-being and uplift. But what happened was you had such a high concentration in cities of people moving there, because that's where the jobs obviously found themselves in. You have Seattle and you have Silicon Valley or San Francisco, and you have New York become these epicenters of business and industrial progress. Whereas before you had a much more dispersed industrial playing field. You could move to random cities in the middle of nowhere, which might have had 1 or 2 large businesses plus many SMEs to support them. But here it is obviously much more, you can only work for Google if you live in Palo Alto or wherever it is. And stemming from that is obviously this massive increase in housing costs, because land is one of those things that's not as fungible, and it's not as it's one-dimensional in the sense that there is only one way to capture and own land, and you can't compound it, you can't put it into the market, you can't, and you have to live there. I mean, it's very simple. Everyone understands real estate, and owning a home, as Oswald Spengler says, is a feeling. It's not just a purchase. It's not just this mechanism by which you transfer a pecuniary amount into a property. It's very much when you buy a house, it becomes your home, and it gives you a certain psychic well-being, a feeling that you can cherish, and you have this hearth whereby you can raise a family. And when you don't have that, what do you get? Well, sorry, this is just an expansion of that, saying boomers could afford to buy houses much earlier than millennials. But when you don't have these options, now you've reduced the optionality. 2 parents must work, and they must have medium to high medium incomes to be able to afford the house and the living style that they want. It's a complete and utter implosion of birth rates. So the number of children goes down. Obviously, this is deleterious for social, Western society in general. I think Westerners have offered what is probably the most propitious and august social environments for the rest of the world for the last 50 years, hence net immigration levels. But in general, the total fertility rate imploding like this is just a sign that decadence has a cost, and the cost is that people want more. Once you turn people into these indefatigable consumers, and they're inexorable in their wants and needs, you can never have enough. You've told them since they were born that there's always more of everything that you would ever want, and you can never be bored, and you can never be satiated. You become this gluttonous monster. This is what you get. You get people who don't want to sacrifice. They don't want to suffer. If they've never had to, and they didn't like it when they did in those seldom occasions, and in doing so, they probably were encouraged to not have to feel like that. Oh, poor baby, come here. Then this coddling effect of not knowing pain, not knowing suffering to any large degree, just engenders a very weak and ill-willed populace. I think in saying that the Übermensch was a much more commonly understood prerogative in the early 20th century than it is in the late 20th century and the early 21st. you don't have people who have a strong will. You have such a you want to call it vertiginous drop from the strong-willed few all the way down to basically the weak-willed many. It's not even a fat tail, or maybe it is. It's a increasingly linear tail at this point, and that effect has as I say, a knock-on effect to the most important part of society, which is around gestation of children and spawning them. Because the more children we have, the more society we have by virtue of an increase in the number of people who are participating in society. And in general, we have what I would say is the continuation of our own, both genetics, but saga, and in the Faustian sense, it really is this continual push for our own expression of our souls, in that children in the Faustian age could be, if not gods, heroes. It is possible for them to be born and have such might and strength and heroic attributes that you can turn into this, and you can become a Napoleon-like figure. It is possible to be a Horatio Nelson or the Lord Clyde. Like, you can be such a strong, imposing and heroic figure that Carlyle will write about you. But in general, at the moment, we don't have much of that environment to culture that. There isn't a general push other than for aesthetic or pleasing reasons, or hedonistic reasons, to want to struggle and strive for things. So the main mechanism is, which is allowing men to, and women to some regard, push themselves in positive directions, is mostly complexes. It's complexes about not being successful with the opposite gender. It's complexes about your own inability and inferiority. It's complexes about your mommy or your daddy or whatever small kind of minor inconvenience was felt during childhood that you've now compounded and snowballed into this horrible thing that's haunting you. I mean, you can see how these are spooks. Rather than waking up and being like, I want to be great, and every single day that I want to expand this greatness and this effect, I have to take one step further up that hill. And this can go into Camus's idea of Sisyphus being happy, but I think that what Camus got wrong in his absurdism is that there is an end to this. You can push that rock and eventually you will get to the top of that hill. Now, if there's another hill behind it that you want to continue to climb, and there's a never-ending amount of them, it's the choice. But the greatness can be felt. You can get to a plateau of greatness and look back down and see that you've come that far. The struggle is not perpetual in the sense it can be achieved, greatness in its way. It can be defined and you can be recognized. And I think once you recognize greatness in others, then you can see it can be done. And by demonstrative effect, QED, there it is, right? So in that, I think that that's what we're lacking, and that spirit is of a bygone era, and which is what I said, the thin thread could be sensed through some boomers. So you have obviously the more realistic, or what we call them skeptical boomers, who have spurned, I would say, more or less of this liberal progressive nonsense, and it truly is a plague, a mental affliction here, where it's deposing you of your wits in a way that's calculated to think that you're being reasonable. It's this, you almost want to call it a parasite in the way that it's transformative. It takes a facsimile of what you think reasonable and right and common sense looks like and projects it, but it's uncanny. It's not the actual representation of something real. It's what you are taught to think is real. It is, once again, to go back to a Max Stirner, it is this Geist, this ghoul, which has been born out of an idea from someone else telling you what they think you should believe, not what they necessarily believe themselves. And I'm not even against hypocrites necessarily. I think you can be hypocritical but still be right. There's a lot of fallacies that go into that, is to say, do as I say, not as I do. But in general, the way that it's painted is they've made a straw man to such a degree that no one believes this except the people they make believe it, like a cult. It's this idea that they've formed for us in our minds to say you should live to this ideal because that's what I wish I was living to, when they had the opportunity and didn't do it. So the demonstrable effect of that is that they don't actually want it. They just want us to want it. And then when you figure out you're being told to do something no one really wants, but you're being told you should anyway, you reject it out of hand. Or if you've ensconced this idea so deep within yourself and it's a kernel that sits right in your soul, then you can't reject it. You'll have a psychic reaction which will be unconscionable. It's something where it is actually an incorrigible behavior to you. It's a trait. You've gone into a habit to such a degree that you'll have a mini stroke basically if you try to reject this, if you repudiate it. And Carl Jung talks quite a lot about this and how we internalize some thoughts to such a degree they become part of us, even though they're clearly parasitical in affectations. I guess no way to segue into this, but the last chart here I've got to show, which is around the I guess another compounding effect as to why society is as poorly as it is. And you have to understand when I design these concepts, it's not that I'm saying we're in a terrible situation where we have nothing and we're all deprived and we're all going hungry. It's more around the effect of saying you have everything you want now, be happy, when we can see the effects of unhappiness borne out in the data. It's that once you start drowning someone in what they want, they'll look for other things, and those other things aren't necessarily good for them, but they're the things that they're going to gravitate towards for X reasons, and usually it's spookified reasons. And in general, we can see that as a output of here I've got on obesity, and why is it that we live in what is the most obese generation ever to have existed. The amount of rotund individuals when you walk down the street is obscene, and this is intuitive. Everyone is disgusted by a fat person. You look in the mirror if you're fat and you don't like what you see. There's a natural reaction towards fat people from children. Children have no filter. They have the mechanism for not understanding social mores, and so they will just react naturally in ways that they find things to be, and they're really good judges of this, where they say, like, if someone's ugly or they've got a massive scar or they've got alopecia and they're balding, they'll say that. And it's not that we necessarily find those people by their nature appalling. It's mostly around what is the natural element that we consider good versus bad or beautiful versus ugly, and how do we project that on the people that we see in a way that we use our inference management internally. And to do that, we go, okay, but fat is very unhealthy. First of all, from a bodily point of view, you're rotting. You're a putrefaction mess. And secondly, I think it's just a natural element of, if you were to reproduce, you should be looking like someone who can reproduce. And this speaks into the heroic male physique, and then inversely, or oppositely, I should probably say, the female reproductive curvy physique. And this is maybe where the disjoint between what we consider curvy and fat is, and how we've lost the parallel towards the male form being quite strong and large, and then the female form representing the softer version of that in a nice way of angles and curves and elements there. But in general, you have what is, and you consider the byproducts of obesity here with, and I think they're probably misattributed sugar here. I don't think sugar is necessarily the problem. This lack of dairy is certainly a problem. And if you had seed oils here, you would probably notice there's a huge preponderance to use seed oils in consumable goods. And seed oils, if you don't know, are mostly PUFAs, which is polyunsaturated fat, and the body is incapable in many ways to digest them properly, and it effectively clogs what is your system. And now scientists will say that's not technically true. Go and have a look at someone who's digesting seed oils versus someone who only subsists on butter or tallow, and then you tell me who looks healthier. I mean, really, it is that simple. I think scientists like to use their, I want to say, credentialism, which is another boomer effect, if we want to tie it back into that, where they say, I'm a scientist, I am a professional, I should know. And I think it's very obvious sometimes just to say, look at the effect. Do you necessarily think that this looks healthy? Is this something where you would consider, if you knew all the facts, what is a good diet versus a bad diet? And these are not very complex thoughts. I think it's mostly around laziness, and you have a very lackadaisical society when it comes to choosing what they eat, because food is so prevalent and so easy to obtain that no one has to put any effort or thought into it. It's I'll just trust, and this is a big boomerism, I'll trust big government, I'll trust society to provide me the things that are not poisonous for me. But as you can see, there's huge failure rates along any range of departments in any government around food safety or around farming and agricultural, and anything in terms of what is a good chemical versus a bad chemical. I mean, we've been producing plastics, which are notoriously horrible. And before that, you had acid rain from the amount of pollution. And before that, you had lead in so many things, including petrol, which was burnt into the atmosphere. You had CFCs, which tore huge holes in the ozone layer. So boomers have been more or less party to all of these things becoming commercialized, and then later on found to be deleterious to human existence. And I think that is just the cost that boomers would have said for growth, rather than being a bit more circumspect about what they were actually introducing. It was all, let's just make more money because that's what we're here for. They don't have the welfare in mind, the actual desired trait of leadership, which is foreseeing a future that's sustainable. It's much more around, how do I get what I want now or in the very near term? And this myopic hubris has obviously led to where we are today, where I don't think anyone is actually too pleased with the political outcomes. The people who won are desirous of something more extreme. So Americans who voted for Trump want the extreme version of the picture that Trump painted, is to say, if you now back down from deportation, so remigration effectively, if you now back down for a considerable cuts to government and government spending, from term limits on politicians, from insider trading laws, all of these policy pillars that he ran on, if he backs down from that, then you will have tumultuous uproar. You will have a very disaffected constituency. Whereas much more on the other side is that everyone who didn't vote for Trump now hates Trump anyway. So you're on a knife edge here where you have to continually push more extreme and extreme, because that's the only way to be effective as that leader. Is you've set yourself up on this ship with one direction to sail, and if you don't sail it, the people on board will be unhappy, and the people who are left on shore will be unhappy anyway. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, but you just now need to live into those promises in that degree, because that's the degree of society that we've engineered. The last maybe sentiment that I'll touch on here, because I can obviously recognize this is going to be an exceptionally long free-form video, but the arrogance, I think, lastly displayed by what is the class of intelligentsia, and going somewhat of a circle back on this, where you had this, the top left here is an ugly commentariat, political commentariat in the UK called Rory Stewart, and he was so famously wrong and incorrect in his predictions of the election that he still is, at least at the time of making the video, refusing to approbate and register his wrongs and like admit defeat. He's saying, I know I'm just too much of a good person. I had too much optimism around the election that I thought Kamala would win, even though he's completely out of touch with reality. Obviously, look at him. I mean, he just looks like a nonce. But secondly, it's the inability for him to understand people and behavior and data. I mean, there were two elements to this election. It's you can follow the data and the voting patterns and the demographic effects of what people in these areas will want when they're based on their skin color, their earning potential, their education levels, their being a parent or not, etc., etc. And on the other hand was the physiognomy. It was the spiritual effect of who we're going to elect to lead us, this old-aged grizzly golden lion or a brown nobody. So, I mean, those are your two options alone were obviously going to have a natural outcome. But in his own arrogance of this neoliberal progressive utopia that he's built in his mind that we all live in, apparently everyone's doing so fantastic in that it's never been a problem for anyone outside of Westminster to ever actually have to struggle and have to find work that they don't necessarily like every day and wake up fat and grumpy and ugly and have the only thing that they can look forward to is getting drunk in the pub with their mates. You live in a society that's deeply unhappy on both sides, but both sides thinking that each side is happy. It's a very bizarre scenario. And this goes into those early YouTube videos where I'm sure all of us have been perusing at some time or another, where we have here Sam Harris, who's obviously gone completely off the deep end in terms of just illogical nonsense and claptrap and babbling about random, his ethics, I think, calcified and crystallized to such a degree on specific understood principles in his mind that he's virtually incapable of intaking anything new or any new system into it. He's almost gone the opposite of Jordan Peterson, who's gone off the wall in terms of trying to integrate a billion different systems into his trying to be coherent mindset, whereas Sam Harris is very, I would say concentrated and not necessarily. I think if you think of it as a Gödel incompleteness theorem, where you can have a complete set that's not necessarily perfect and a perfect set was not necessarily complete. He thinks his complete set is perfect, and I think in that we can learn a lot about why Sam Harris is a moron. And then you have Dawkins, which is a man in denial. He went through what I would say is probably the naturalistic atheistic period, and he was quite vociferous in his leanings here. And I don't necessarily disagree with some of his positions in terms of why atheism is considered a contender for the most logical point of view from a spiritual point of view. I'm not myself an atheist in that way, but I think I understood his process, but his association of religion then towards society was, for him, such a throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You can't have Christianity or the effects of Christianity and atheism because they're irreconcilable. And they're mutually exclusive to such a degree that you have to get rid of the institutional effects of these things. And that's not even saying he understood the underlying effects of why Faustian societies, because that's what he really wants to get to. He actually wants to get to the end game here, which is understanding the Faustian effect, that Woden is sitting there above us, guiding us, whereas his attribution to, I think, a lot of things that were negative in society was the Christian church, which definitely was a dysfunctional institution, but so was its predecessor, and so as a subsequent government. The overreach of a government is exactly the same as the overreach of a church. They're corrupt in the same-ish ways, and the class of men, particularly men, there are some women, but the class of men who rule these institutions is always the self-serving and sycophantic, kowtowing, corrupt officials. And this is the way that they construct these institutions, is to benefit themselves, and that they reward the people in the institutions below them who are brown-nosing and sycophants. So this cronyism obviously is also an unsaid rule here, but and this is what he does not understand and did not understand, is that he was able to live through what was a prosperous society by virtue of the fact that a lot of his forefathers, and probably direct, had to fight in wars throughout the 19th century for that. You don't have a British Empire which is able to produce so much grandeur and so much miraculous growth for this one small island without these sacrifices, these men fighting these wars against savages across the world. But he's incapable of understanding why the men would do that, because he's too rational. He's too much in this rootless urban intellectual. And I think the last person I will mention is Hitchens, and we all appreciate, I think, a good Hitch slap, or those videos of him arguing very forcefully and in his very erudite way. And obviously it helps that he's well spoken and articulate. But the problem with Hitchens, and I think that goes even more so for his brother Peter, who's still with us, is that there's so much of the boomer generation that they become ideologues of it, and it's ingrained in them that they have to believe in a doctrine, and a doctrine has to inform them of things to think in the way that they should think them. So they're this paralleled on the inside of a window of common sense, looking out into what is the rest of the chaos of the celestial being, of where we actually participate in life. They're that kid that's been trapped inside watching the other boys play and then is describing it and understanding it in the way that they only do, but they've never actually played. This is that inhibition, the boomer inhibition that I'm telling you about. It is the zeitgeist, the spooks which have trapped them, and they've been encapsulated by these things to such a serious and maltreated degree. And so what happens is you become a misbegotten thinker. You cannot function intelligently in a way that we like. You're intelligent only in the bounded system that you've created to be intelligent in. And so with that restriction, you get what is boomerism. And boomerism has been since the 60s, 70s, through to the 2020s. And the end of the 2020s, maybe we'll see the collapse of boomerism to such a final degree. On the death of Trump, I would probably earmark it to have finally died and fallen away. He is the last, in a good way, gasp of the or genteel but idolized boomer, in that he was able to achieve all these things just by being the perfect, do what I want when I want boomer, versus what we have is obviously the malicious planning, sycophantic political boomer, and that's the ones I've got shown here. So in general, I think that's how we should think about the issues of boomerism, why they've come to be, and then I'll leave you here with a quote from Thomas Carlyle. And this, I think, speaks into why democracy is one of those things that boomers love to tout. And they'll tell you that democracy is under threat, or it's the blessing, or it's the best thing you've ever witnessed, etc., etc. But here we go. Carlyle says, democracy, which means despair of finding any heroes to govern you, and contented putting up with the want of them. Alas, thou too, mein Lieber, seest well how close it is of kin to atheism, and other sad isms. He who discovers no God whatever, how shall he discover heroes, the visible temples of God? Strange enough, meanwhile, it is to observe with that thoughtlessness, here in our rigidity, a conservative country, men rush into democracy with full cry. The notion that a man's liberty consists in giving his vote at election hustings and saying, behold, now I too have my 20,000th part of a talker in our national palaver. Will not all the gods be good to me? Is one of the pleasantest. Nature, nevertheless, is kind at present, and puts it into the heads of many, almost all. And that ought, if nothing else at all, should convince you of the foresight of men of greatness and how they would detest this boomer individuality egalitarianism.